My parents didn't ask me to help my younger brother with money. They asked me to give him my entire house. What they didn't realize was that their golden child had a secret that would destroy their story. My name is Anna Hill, and I live in Phoenix. Last year, when I was 28, I bought my first house. That sentence still feels strange to say out loud. Growing up, owning a house felt like something other people did. My dad, Thomas, worked as a welder for most of my childhood. My mom, Helen, worked as a clerk at a local office supply store. They worked hard. I'll never deny that. But if you grew up in our house, one thing became clear pretty quickly. My younger brother Ryan was the center of everything. Ryan is 3 years younger than me. Growing up, he had this way of talking his way out of trouble. Teachers loved him. Neighbors thought he was charming. And my parents? They treated him like he could do no wrong. If Ryan got a bad grade, my mom blamed the teacher. If Ryan skipped homework, my dad said he was just bored with school. If Ryan got into trouble, someone else was always responsible. Meanwhile, I was the opposite. I learned early that if I wanted anything, I had to earn it myself. I worked my first job at 16. A small coffee shop not far from our house. I saved almost everything I made. In college, I worked 2 jobs while studying finance. One was at a bank downtown. The other was tutoring students in the evenings. Ryan, on the other hand, went to college for exactly 1 semester. Then he came home and announced it wasn't for him. My parents didn't argue. My mom said college was overrated anyway. After that, Ryan bounced between jobs. For a while, he worked at a car dealership, then a furniture store. Eventually, he became a salesman, which honestly suited him. Talking people into things was his strongest skill. But even then, Ryan never seemed worried about money. Because somehow, things always worked out for him. If he missed rent, my parents helped. If his car broke down, my parents helped. If he wanted to take a trip with friends, my parents somehow found a way to help. By the time I was 28, I had spent almost a decade saving money. Carefully. Painfully. I lived in small apartments around Phoenix that always seemed to come with problems. One place had a broken air conditioner during the summer. If you've never experienced July in Phoenix without AC, trust me, it's not something you forget. Another apartment had plumbing that rattled every time someone in the building flushed a toilet. I shared apartments with roommates who left dishes everywhere and blasted music at 2 in the morning. But every month I saved something, even if it was just a couple $100s. Because I had one goal. I wanted my own place. When I finally started talking to a loan officer at the bank where I worked, Daniel Ford, I expected him to tell me I still needed a few more years. Instead, he looked at my savings and said, "Anna, you're closer than you think." I remember sitting there in his office feeling like someone had just told me I'd won the lottery. A few months later, I met Maria Cross, a real estate agent who helped me start looking at houses. Most of what we saw were small places. 2 bedrooms. Older neighborhoods. Nothing fancy. But one house stood out. 3 bedrooms. Quiet street. Small backyard with a tree that somehow survived the desert heat. It wasn't huge, but it was mine. The day I signed the paperwork felt surreal. I remember sitting in the empty living room after I got the keys. Just sitting on the floor, staring at the walls. For the first time in my life, I felt stable. Like maybe all the years of working and saving had actually led somewhere. When I told my parents, they were excited. At least at first. My mom kept saying, "I can't believe my daughter owns a house." My dad walked through every room like he was inspecting it for hidden problems. Ryan even came over that first weekend. He leaned against the kitchen counter and said, "Not bad, Anna. Didn't think you'd actually pull it off." I laughed it off. For a little while, everything felt normal. My parents came by once or twice. My mom brought a houseplant. My dad helped fix a loose cabinet hinge. Ryan mostly just joked about when I'd host parties. If the story had ended there, things would have been fine. But about 3 months after I moved in, my mom called me. She said, "Anna, your dad and I want to have dinner with you this weekend. Just the 3 of us." Her voice sounded strange. Careful. I didn't think much of it at the time. I assumed maybe something had happened with my grandmother or one of my relatives. So that Saturday evening, I drove over to my parents' house. The same house I grew up in. The same kitchen where my dad used to read the newspaper and my mom used to lecture Ryan about cleaning his room. But the moment I walked inside, I could tell something was off. My dad was sitting at the table, staring at his coffee mug. My mom was pacing near the sink. No one was talking. When I sat down, my dad cleared his throat. Then he said something that immediately made my stomach tighten. "Your brother is going through a hard time." When my dad said, "Your brother is going through a hard time," my first thought was honestly, that could mean anything. With Ryan Hill, a hard time could mean he quit another job, crashed another car, or decided he needed money for something my parents would eventually end up paying for. I sat down at the kitchen table and asked, "What happened?" My mom and dad exchanged a look. That alone made me uneasy. My mom finally spoke. Ryan has some financial problems. She said it carefully, like she was choosing every word. I leaned back in the chair. Okay, what kind of financial problems? My dad rubbed his forehead. Debt, he said. That was vague enough that I asked the obvious question. How much debt? Neither of them answered right away. That silence stretched long enough that I felt something heavy settle in my chest. Finally, my mom said, around 40,000. I blinked. $40,000? My dad nodded. Now I was trying to do the math in my head. Ryan was 25. He had never held a job longer than maybe a year. How does someone even get $40,000 in debt? I asked. My mom waved her hand slightly. Credit cards. Loans. Some car payments. She said it like the explanation didn't really matter. But to me it mattered a lot. Because that number didn't appear overnight. That kind of debt builds slowly. It takes months. Years. Which meant Ryan had been digging this hole for a long time. And apparently nobody had said anything. I looked back and forth between my parents. So what's the plan? I asked. My dad leaned forward slightly. We were hoping you might be able to help. That didn't surprise me. If I was being honest, I expected something like that. Maybe they wanted me to loan him a few $1,000s. Help him consolidate the debt. Something reasonable. I sighed a little and said, I don't have 40,000 sitting around. I just bought a house. My mom quickly said, oh, we're not asking for that. Something in her tone made me suspicious. I asked, then what are you asking? My mom hesitated. Then she said the sentence that still doesn't feel real even now. Well, you have that house. For a second, I thought maybe she was about to ask if Ryan could stay there temporarily. That would have been awkward, but at least it would make sense. So I said, yeah. She gave this small smile. We were thinking maybe you could transfer the house to Ryan. The words landed so strangely that my brain didn't process them at first. I just stared at her. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because it sounded like a joke. I said, sorry, what? My dad spoke this time. You're single, he said calmly. You don't really need all that space. I stared at him. He continued like he was explaining something simple. Ryan needs stability right now. My heart started pounding. You're asking me to give him my house? My mom immediately corrected me. Not give, she said quickly. Just transfer it to him. I leaned back in the chair and stared at both of them. I honestly wondered if I was misunderstanding something. You know I have a mortgage, right? I said. My mom nodded like that detail didn't matter. Well, yes, but things can be rearranged. I looked at my dad. He shrugged slightly. You could move back into an apartment for a while. That was the moment everything shifted in my head. Because I realized they weren't joking. This wasn't a weird suggestion. This was a plan they had already discussed. They had sat somewhere together and decided that the logical solution to Ryan's debt was for me to give up the house I spent years saving for. I felt my chest tighten. I worked for 6 years to buy that house, I said slowly. My mom gave me a look like I was being dramatic. And your brother needs help now. I shook my head. No. I said it immediately. No hesitation. Just one word. My parents looked surprised. My mom frowned slightly. Anna, family helps family. I took a breath. I've helped Ryan plenty of times, I said. But I'm not giving him my house. My dad leaned back in his chair. You're not giving it, he said again. You're just transferring it so he can get back on his feet. That's the same thing, I said. My mom's voice got sharper. You're being selfish. That word hit me harder than it should have. Because if there was one thing I had never been in that family, it was selfish. I was the one who lent money when my parents needed help paying bills. I was the one who drove Ryan to job interviews when his car broke down. I was the one who babysat relatives' kids, helped my grandmother move, showed up whenever someone needed something. But now suddenly I was selfish. Because I wouldn't give away my house. I'm not doing it, I said again. My dad sighed. Anna, think about what this would mean for your brother. I am thinking about it, I said. And it's not my responsibility. The room went quiet. My mom crossed her arms. I didn't raise you to turn your back on your family. I felt anger creeping in. You didn't raise me to work this hard just to hand everything to Ryan either. That was probably the first time in years I had said something like that out loud. My mom's expression changed immediately. Cold. You've always had a problem with your brother. I stared at her. No, I said. I have a problem with this. My dad stood up from the table. Just think about it, he said. I already did. My mom shook her head. You'll regret this. I left a few minutes later. The drive back to my house felt surreal. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, trying to figure out if maybe I misunderstood something. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. My parents genuinely believed Ryan deserved my house more than I did. And when I pulled into my driveway that night, I sat in the car for a moment staring at the front door. The same door I unlocked 3 months earlier feeling proud. Now it felt like something else. Like a line had been drawn. What I didn't realize yet was that my parents weren't done. Because when they couldn't convince me, they decided to tell the rest of the family their version of the story. About a week after that dinner, my phone started ringing more than usual. At first, I didn't think anything of it. My family wasn't huge, but we stayed in touch enough that random calls weren't unusual. The first call came from my aunt, Jane Hill. Jane lived in Madison, Wisconsin with her husband, my uncle Peter Hill. Peter worked as a coach at a local high school, and Jane ran her own dental clinic. They hosted big family gatherings a couple times a year, which meant most of the family eventually ended up at their house. Jane had always been one of the calmer people in our family. So when I answered the phone and heard hesitation in her voice, I immediately knew something was wrong. "Anna," she said carefully, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." She paused for a moment. "Is everything okay between you and Ryan?" That question made my stomach tighten. "Why?" "Well," she said slowly, "your mom mentioned that Ryan is having a really hard time right now. Financially." I didn't say anything. Jane continued. "She said he asked for help and that you refused." There it was. I leaned back in my chair. "What exactly did she tell you?" Jane hesitated again. "She said Ryan's in serious debt and that you have a big house now and plenty of space, but you didn't want to help him." My chest felt hot, because I could already hear the way that story sounded from the outside. Selfish sister refuses to help struggling brother. Simple. Clean. Completely missing the part where they asked me to give up my house. "What else did she say?" I asked. Jane lowered her voice slightly. "She said you told them Ryan needed to fix his own mistakes." I closed my eyes for a moment. "That part's true," I said. Jane sighed softly. "Anna, I'm not judging you. I just wanted to understand." I appreciated that more than she probably realized. "Thanks," I said quietly. After we hung up, I sat there thinking about the conversation. But that wasn't the last call. 2 days later, my cousin Kelly Hill messaged me. Kelly was Jane and Peter's daughter. She worked as a painter and lived not far from her parents in Madison. Her message was short. "Hey, what's going on with Ryan?" I asked what she meant. She replied almost immediately. "My grandma said you're refusing to help him and everyone's upset." I stared at my phone. So the story had already traveled further. That night, my grandmother called me. Margaret Hill had a way of sounding worried even when she wasn't. "Anna," she said softly, "your parents told me Ryan is struggling and that you don't want to help him." Hearing it from her made something inside me snap a little, because I realized something important. My parents weren't just disappointed in me. They were actively telling everyone their version of the story. And that version made me look like the villain. I kept my voice calm. "Grandma," I said, "did they tell you what kind of help they asked for?" She paused. "Well, they said Ryan needed stability." Of course they did. I didn't explain everything right then. I just told her there was more to the story. But the frustration kept building. Because suddenly people were looking at me differently. A few relatives sent me messages about how family should support each other. One even wrote, "Money isn't everything." I wanted to respond, "Good. Then you give him your house." But I didn't. Instead, I kept replaying the dinner conversation in my head, trying to understand how my parents thought this would work. Then something unexpected happened. About 4 days later, I got a message from someone I didn't know well. Justin Moon. Justin had grown up around our neighborhood. He wasn't exactly one of Ryan's close friends, but they ran into each other often enough. Justin now worked as a guard at a sports bar in Phoenix. His message was simple. "Hey Anna, I heard some stuff about Ryan. Thought you should know something." That immediately got my attention. I replied and asked what he meant. A few minutes later he called me. His voice sounded awkward, like he wasn't sure how to start the conversation. "Look," he said, "I'm not trying to cause drama. But Ryan's been coming into the bar a lot lately." "Okay," I said. Justin continued. "He's been betting on games." I frowned. "Like, sports betting?" "Yeah." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. "How often?" Justin gave a short laugh. "Pretty much every night there's a game on." My mind immediately went back to that number my parents mentioned. $40,000. Suddenly it didn't feel as mysterious. "Has he been winning?" I asked. Justin didn't even hesitate. "No." That answer hung in the air. Then he added something else. "He's been talking about chasing losses." If you've ever known someone who gambles, that phrase says everything. Chasing losses means someone keeps betting more money trying to win back what they already lost, which usually makes things worse. "How long has he been doing this?" I asked quietly. Justin sighed. "Months. Maybe longer." My chest felt tight, because suddenly the entire situation made sense. The debt, the urgency, the desperation. It wasn't random. Ryan had gambled himself into a hole, and my parents either didn't know, or they were choosing not to say it. When I hung up the phone, I sat in silence for a long time. Then something in my mind shifted. Up until that point, I had been trying to stay quiet, trying not to make things worse. But my parents had already told their story to everyone, and their story made me look like the selfish one. A few days later, my uncle Peter called. "Hey Anna," he said. "You coming to the barbecue next weekend?" Every summer he hosted one at his house in Madison, Wisconsin. A bunch of relatives would fly in or drive up. Normally, I might have skipped it. But this time I said yes. Because by then, I had decided something. If my parents were going to tell everyone their version of the story, then maybe it was time the whole family heard the real one. The barbecue at Peter Hill's house was the kind of family event I used to enjoy. His place in Madison, Wisconsin had a big backyard with a wooden deck and enough space for a dozen people to spread out with folding chairs and coolers. Every summer, he hosted the same gathering. Burgers on the grill, music playing quietly, relatives catching up on everything that happened during the year. Normally, those weekends felt relaxed. This one didn't. Because by the time I arrived, I already knew most of the people there had heard my parents' version of the story. The selfish sister. The struggling brother. The house I refused to share. I flew in the night before and stayed at a small hotel. The next afternoon, I drove over to my uncle's place. The moment I walked through the gate into the backyard, I felt the shift. Conversations paused. A few relatives gave me polite smiles. Others looked curious, like they were trying to figure out what kind of person refuses to help her own brother. My mom and dad were already there. Helen Hill stood near the grill talking to Jane Hill, holding a drink in one hand. My dad, Thomas Hill, sat at a patio table with a couple of uncles, quietly listening while they talked about work. And Ryan? Ryan leaned against the fence, scrolling through his phone. When he looked up and saw me, his expression tightened slightly. Not angry, just uncomfortable. I walked over and greeted everyone normally. No confrontation. No speeches. Not yet. For a while things felt almost normal. My Uncle Peter Hill was grilling burgers, joking about how everyone from Phoenix always complained about the Wisconsin humidity. My cousin Kelly Hill asked me about my house. Jane talked about her dental clinic. But every now and then I caught pieces of conversations that reminded me why I was there. Someone asking my mom quietly if Ryan was doing okay. Someone else mentioning how tough financial problems can be. It was subtle, but it was there. Eventually my Uncle Peter pulled me aside near the cooler. He lowered his voice slightly. "Anna, can I ask you something?" I already knew what it would be. "Sure." He scratched the back of his neck. "Your dad mentioned Ryan's in a rough spot." "Of course he did." Peter continued carefully. "Family's supposed to help each other." There it was again. I took a slow breath. "Did they tell you what kind of help they asked for?" Peter hesitated. "Well, they said Ryan needed stability." The same word my grandmother used. Stability. I nodded slowly. Then I said something simple. "You know Ryan owes about $40,000, right?" Peter blinked. "Yeah, they mentioned debt." I shook my head slightly. "He didn't get that debt from medical bills or rent." Peter frowned. "Then what?" I held his gaze. "Sports betting." The reaction was immediate. Peter's eyebrows shot up. "Gambling?" "Yeah." He looked genuinely shocked. "Ryan?" I nodded. "He's been betting for months." Peter stared at me for a moment, clearly processing the information. Then he said something that confirmed what I already suspected. "They didn't tell anyone that." "Of course they didn't." I shrugged. "They told everyone I refused to help him." Peter didn't say anything for a few seconds. Then he slowly nodded. "Well, that's different." Word travels quickly at family gatherings, especially when people start whispering. Within maybe 15 minutes, I could feel the shift happening around the backyard. Conversations got quieter. People glanced toward Ryan. Someone asked him a question about football bets. And suddenly the story my parents had been telling didn't sound so simple anymore. My mom noticed the change too. She walked over toward us with a tight expression. "Anna," she said sharply, "what are you telling people?" I looked at her calmly. "The truth." Her face flushed immediately. "You're humiliating your brother." Ryan was standing a few feet away now. He looked embarrassed. Not angry. Just caught. My dad approached a moment later. "What's going on here?" he asked. Peter answered before I could. "Apparently Ryan's debt came from gambling." My dad's expression hardened. "That's not the point." I almost laughed. Of course it wasn't the point for them. The point was that their story was falling apart. My mom crossed her arms. "You didn't have to say anything." That sentence stuck with me, because it perfectly summed up the entire situation. They didn't want the truth. They wanted silence. I shrugged slightly. "You told everyone I refused to help Ryan," I said. "I just explained why." No yelling. No dramatic scene. Just the facts. The barbecue continued after that, but the atmosphere had changed. People still ate and talked, but the conversations were different. Less judgment. More curiosity. A few relatives quietly came over to talk to me. Some apologized for assuming things earlier. Others simply said they understood now. My parents barely spoke to me for the rest of the afternoon. Ryan avoided eye contact entirely. Later that evening, as people started leaving, my Uncle Peter pulled me aside again. "I'm glad you said something," he said quietly. "Yeah," he nodded. "People deserve the whole story." A few weeks have passed since that barbecue. Things with my parents are distant. We talk occasionally, but it's polite and short. Ryan moved back into their house in Phoenix. Apparently, he couldn't keep up with his payments anymore. And my house? It's still mine. Sometimes, late at night, I sit on the couch in the living room and think about that dinner. The moment my parents asked me to give this place away. Part of me still feels a little guilty, because they genuinely believe I should have helped Ryan. But another part of me keeps coming back to the same thought. If I had given him the house, what would he have learned? Would he have stopped gambling? Would he have taken responsibility for anything? Or would he have simply found another way to fall apart while someone else cleaned up the mess? I worked for years to build a life where I didn't have to depend on anyone, where I finally felt secure. And when my parents asked me to give that up for my brother, I realized something important. Sometimes the hardest part about growing up isn't standing up to strangers. It's standing up to your own family. So, was I wrong for refusing to give my brother my house, even if it would have solved his problems?